Smythe and his wife were hauled off to the Tower of London. Denying everything, Smythe claimed he had had no communication with the Earl for years, and that he met him on the fateful morning merely to pass on a message from the Lord Mayor. As stories go, it was a lamer excuse than told by many a commoner condemned for treason and sent to Tyburn's Triple Tree, there to be castrated, disemboweled, and hanged, beheaded, and dismembered. Smythe was spared, perhaps because he had lent Elizabeth £31,000 to help equip the fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada, perhaps because it was thought not to be financially prudent to kill the richest man in the country. Whatever the reason, Smythe was deprived of all his offices and ordered to pay a substantial fine. In the language of the Privy Council, Thomas Smythe had forgotten his duty to Her Majesty. The great merchant did not languish long in disgrace. In March 1603, the 69-year-old Elizabeth was overcome by an illness that signalled the end of her long reign. Her successor, James I, was generous to all those who had been linked to the Essex Rebellion, including Thomas Smythe. The main reason was that James himself had plotted with Essex. Within a month of assuming the English throne, James not only restored Smythe to all his offices, but also knighted him. Sir Thomas Smythe would be James I's chief adviser on trade, with a special interest in the colonization of the New World. Smythe would hold this position for the rest of his life, and use it to ensure that when England's new colony was eventually planted in America, it would survive, whatever the human cost in life or liberty. He had taken the first step 3 years later when he joined the race to plant the first permanent colony in Virginia, and found that his rival was the most feared man in the realm, Sir John Popham. Chapter 2. The Judge's Dream. The Kennebec River runs gently down through the wooded uplands of Maine to the sea. Its source is Moosehead Lake, a stretch of water so large that it once was mistaken for the China Sea. From this great lake, the Kennebec flows 150 miles through New England before draining into the North Atlantic near a windy point of land called Sabino Head. It was here that 400 years ago a fortress was built by Englishmen, used by other Englishmen as their chattels or slaves. Fort St. George would be formidable had it survived. A blueprint discovered nearly 300 years later shows it with thick battlements, great crenellated gates, several mansions, a church, 50 other buildings, and a walled garden. A dozen cannon point towards the sea. Construction was well under way when the settlement was suddenly deserted, leaving the fort to crumble back into the earth. Today, the fort exists as the merest outline etched in the landscape, revealing little of the philosophy or vision that impelled men to build it. The settlement was the project of Sir John Popham, one of the most powerful men in the government of Queen Elizabeth I. Popham was the first to put to the test Sir Humphrey Gilbert's proposal for colonizing America with the dregs of England. What Popham tried would one day be one of the most hated features of English rule in America. Ambitions buried at Fort St. George were to live on and change the face of North America. Work on the short-lived fortress had begun in August 1607. It was to be the centerpiece of a new colony. A charter issued the previous year by King James I restated England's claim to Virginia, the entire length of the eastern American seaboard from Canada to Florida, and authorized the establishment of 2 colonies. One, under the aegis of Sir Thomas Smythe, was to be in the south, between the 38th and 41st parallels. The other, under the guidance of the Lord Chief Justice Sir John Popham, was to be located to the north, in New England. The charter signalled a new approach to England's hoped-for conquest and share in the New World. Hitherto, all England's colonial ventures in America had been individualistic forays, each one ultimately dependent on the vision, finances, and staying power of one man. By the early 1600s, this was starting to be recognized as a fatal weakness. An anonymous broadside circulating at the time reflected on 20 years of failure. Private purses are cold comfort to adventurers, and have ever been found fatal to all enterprises hitherto undertaken by the English, by reason of delays, jealousies, and unwillingness to back that project which succeeded not at the first attempt. The broadside argued for a stock, a joint stock company that could take a long view and ride the kind of setbacks that had been the ruin of so many previous ventures. Joint stock companies were relatively new entities in which individuals owned shares they could sell without reference to their fellow stockholders. These companies were opening the far corners of the globe to English trade, so why not a joint stock company to fund the next big English push to colonize America? Interest in America had been largely dormant since 1590, when the financial drain persuaded Walter Raleigh to give up his Roanoke adventure. 12 years went by, and then a new round of exploration began. It was led by Bartholomew Gosnold, a friend of Richard Hakluyt and Raleigh. Accompanied by Bartholomew Gilbert, one of Sir Humphrey Gilbert's 6 sons, Gosnold landed in New England in 1602 and stayed for several months, trading and exploring. They returned with sensational reports that rhapsodized over the natural riches of the New World. The soil is fat and lusty, cherry trees like ours, but the stalks bear the blossom or fruit which are like a cluster of grapes. All sorts of fowls, whose young ones we took and ate at our pleasure, ground nuts as big as eggs. Gosnold summed up their reaction as they caught the first sight of all this plenty. We stood a while as ravished. The following year, a merchant from Bristol, Martin Pring, landed in Virginia looking for the sassafras tree, the root of which was then used to treat the French pox and is today, in a marvelous piece of serendipity, used in the perfumery trade. 2 years after Pring, George Weymouth came looking for a settlement site in what is now Maine. Pring and Weymouth were down-to-earth seamen, with none of Gosnold's descriptive flair, but they did enough to stoke the fires of enthusiasm for America still more. "The land is full of God's good blessings," said Pring. Weymouth made the same point more graphically, returning with intriguing samples of plant and animal life, and 5 captured Native Americans all London wanted to see. Despite the fact that Gosnold and the other mariners had found not a scrap of evidence for the existence of gold mines, these expeditions sparked new speculation about gold waiting to be discovered in America. The fantastical stories of golden cities brought back 3 decades earlier by that wandering seaman David Ingram had not been forgotten, and American gold became the talk of taverns and counting houses. The Spanish dream of El Dorado, the Golden Man, had led to the discovery of fantastic treasures in South America. The English, it was argued, would find theirs in the northern continent. A taste of the fantastic hopes that developed can be had from Ben Jonson's satire on gold fever, Eastward Ho!, staged at the same time as Shakespeare was putting on Macbeth. Jonson imagines the lost Roanoke colonists marrying into the local population and living in a society literally covered in gold. "Why, man," exclaims a character, "all their dripping pans are pure gold, and all the chains with which they chain up their streets are massy gold. All the prisoners they take are fettered in gold, and for rubies and diamonds they go forth on holidays and gather 'em by the seashore." It was in this atmosphere that the charter authorizing the 2 new forays to America was drawn up, and 2 joint stock companies of knights, gentlemen, merchants, and other adventurers created for the purpose. The two principal aims were announced as bringing infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility, and the mining of gold, silver, and copper. 3 of the Crown's leading councillors helped draft the document: Robert Cecil, Chief Secretary of State, Sir Edward Coke, Attorney General, and the fearsome Lord Chief Justice, Sir John Popham. Cecil emerged as principal patron of the company that was allocated the Southern Territory, lying roughly between what is now Florida and New York. It was composed of men drawn mainly from our city of London, and inevitably became known as the London Company, and later the Virginia Company. The key post of treasurer of the company, equivalent to managing director, was taken by Sir Thomas Smythe. Sir John Popham was the principal investor in the second company, drawn from our cities of Bristol and Exeter and of our town of Plymouth, and allocated New England. It came to be known as the Plymouth Company. Popham was a man whose character was written in his face. In one portrait he appears a physical giant, the scarlet robes of the High Court clutched around his bulk, a heavy, ugly face glaring out, cold eyes, cunning and suspicious, the face of a calculating, unstoppable bully. In his voluminous Lives of the Chief Justices of England, Lord Campbell refers to the portrait and adds decorously, "I am afraid he would not appear to great advantage in a sketch of his moral qualities, which lest I do him an injustice I will not attempt." Sir John was the man who had passed the death sentence on Sir Walter Raleigh, telling him, "It is best for man not to seek to climb too high, lest he fall." He had participated in the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, and condemned to death Guy Fawkes and hundreds more. The miracle was that he did not join them on the gallows himself. Before he occupied one by one most of the great legal offices of state, John Popham had been a highwayman, and, according to one rumour, probably a garroter too. Popham was born in 1531 into an affluent Somerset family. He read law at Balliol College, Oxford, and in his 20s he was called to the bar and respectably married. Even then, however, he was exhibiting a different side to his character. He was a heavy drinker and a gambler, and according to Lord Campbell, either to supply his profligate expenditure or to show his spirit, Popham frequently sallied forth at night from a hostel in Southwark, with a band of desperate characters, and, planting themselves in ambush on Shooter's Hill, or taking other positions favourable for attack and escape, they stopped travellers, and took from them not only their money, but any valuable commodities they carried with them, boasting that they were always civil and generous, and that to avoid serious consequences they went in such numbers as to render resistance impossible. Popham's antics continued right through his 20s. Amazingly, he was never caught. In his 30s he decided he could make as much money from the law as from highway robbery, and developed an extensive practice in southwest England that brought him to the attention of the Queen. With her rare ability to pick ruthless talent that could be used one day, Elizabeth arranged a seat in Parliament for him. The former highwayman became Speaker of the House, then Attorney General, and finally Lord Chief Justice. He was a hanging judge, says Campbell. Ordinary larcenies, and above all, in highway robbery, there was little chance of acquittal. It was the same with those who did not fit the Protestant orthodoxies the Crown was trying to mould. Sir John pursued outspoken Puritans and Catholic priests to the scaffold. Under him, hundreds of Jesuits and suspected sympathizers were sent to Tyburn or Smithfield to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, or, if a woman, perhaps to be crushed to death or strangled before being burnt at the stake. When it came to the rich, Sir John could be lenient if the price was right. There was no more corrupt age than the Elizabethan, and the future Lord Chief Justice proved himself as buyable as any. In the 1580s, a midwife's story horrified all who heard it. She told of being taken blindfolded in a closed coach to attend the delivery of a child in a great house, and after the birth seeing a masked man seize the newborn infant and cast it into the fire, where it perished. When the story became known, a hue and cry was raised for the perpetrator of what Lord Macaulay called this horrible and mysterious crime. The murderer was tracked down, only to be let off after he paid the judge and the